Thank you all so much for being here at Recirculation. I want to introduce our two guests for tonight. First, we have César Cuauhtémoc García Hernández, is the Gregory H. Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties in the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law and Immigration Lawyer. He has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, The Guardian, and many other venues. The author of Crimmigration Law, as well as Migrating to Prison, The New Press. Oh, hello? Yeah, okay. He lives in Denver, Colorado, and you can read more at www.ccgarciahernandez.com. We also have Cristian Farias, is a legal journalist and a senior editor at Inquest, an online magazine for decarceral ideas. Sorry about that. His work, which explores the intersection of law and politics, has appeared in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, The Atlantic, GQ, The New Yorker, The Nation, Slate, and other outlets. He lives in New Jersey. Please give a warm round of applause to both our authors tonight. Thank you.
César, it is a pleasure to speak with you today. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much.
How's the book tour so far?
I'm still standing, so it's good.
For those of you who may not know, 4 years ago to the day almost, César and I were sitting across each other at the Roosevelt House here in New York, right before the pandemic. It was personally my last public appearance anywhere, and I had the pleasure to speak to him about his prior book, Migrating to Prison. And now I'm here sitting across from you.
We've been assured that there's no causal relationship.
There is, and I hope there's no pandemic after this.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I guess a good way to start off. How do you go from that book, Migrating to Prison, and for those of you who may not be up to speed, in that book, César argued very forcefully that all kinds of immigration detention should be abolished, as well as immigration policing. And so how do you go from that argument to the argument you make in Welcome the Wretched? Did that book plant the seeds for this one? Or maybe this came before, but you put it in the back burner somehow?
Yeah. So no, you're exactly right. Actually, this book, the idea for this book, the came years before, but I wasn't ready to write it, and I think I had to sort of lay the groundwork for this book because it is a bigger book in terms of its scope and in terms of the challenge that it presents to the way that law in the United States operates right now, where it's just so heavily in which immigration law is so heavily dependent on the outcomes of criminal proceedings. And Migrating to Prison certainly touches on that, but is narrowly focused on the way that immigration law is enforced, or one way in which immigration law is enforced through the use of incarceration. Right? And Welcome the Wretched, I'm taking a much bigger picture, sort of a step backwards, back and taking a broader view of the more fundamental reliance on criminal law that immigration law has developed over the last few decades. And so I think this book very much builds on that last one.
Wonderful. And now it's interesting because when César released his prior book in 2019, or towards the end of 2019, if I'm not mistaken, at the time, you may remember who was president. You may remember what the political climate was at the time. So to argue for the abolishment of immigration imprisonment, it almost seemed counterintuitive given who was in power at the time. And now it's interesting because you're making a broad-based argument about just decoupling immigration law from criminal law. And it comes once again at a very, so to speak, pivotal time for immigration law and policy, in the sense that you've probably seen the news lately with the new Senate bill on immigration that was released, and the ongoing situation at the border, which some call a crisis, other people call it as basically a symptom of a much broader and deeper disease. And I guess the question that I have for you is, and don't tell me if you've gotten any hate emails from this book yet, but is it?
I have.
Okay.
I won't tell you what they say, but I have. Yes.
But is it? It seems like all your books come at really kind of really special times for kind of the political climate that we're in, and obviously that's not calculated. But I'm curious, what is it like as an author to be coming with this new work at a time when no one seems to agree on what we should do?
Yeah, I think that's more of a symptom of the state of politics around immigration policy more than any kind of, brilliant planning on my part. The sad reality is that we're sort of in a rut when it comes to the way that politicians talk about what we can possibly do when it comes to immigration. The bill that was released over the weekend, most of it is focused on giving more money to Department of Homeland Security to hire more Border Patrol agents, to hire more ICE officers, to pay for more detention beds, and all the while the trade-off is we'll also put in this provision through which we shut off access to asylum, right? And that's not very likely to result in anything different from what we're currently seeing, because it's just an expanded version of the policies that got us to this point. And so I actually think that writing books that are so against the grain of the political conversation is a way of injecting a little bit of hope into what are rather dreadful conversations that come out of Washington on most days. Because what I'm suggesting is that we take a look at the historical evolution of immigration law in the United States and try to learn not just from the past 5 years or 5 months, but from the entire history of immigration law, of immigration in the United States, to the United States, and immigration law in the United States. And perhaps somewhere in that, in those decades and decades of struggling with very similar dynamics, there's something useful to mine, and that's why I try to take advantage of some of these stories of rather ordinary people. Right, this guy Louis Loftus Rapollier, who used to work at Columbia, actually at Columbia Medical Center, doing like the most mundane thing imaginable. He was a little elevator operator, right? So people who push the buttons to make the elevators go up and down, and he was pretty unremarkable until that one day when he did something that was so remarkable that I decided, oh, this is a great story with which to begin one of the chapters of the book, because in that moment he actually takes a life, and he doesn't just take any life, but he takes the life of one of his kids, right? And yet the courts decide, actually, we're going to let you continue living in the United States because, as one of the judges who's reviewing his citizenship application says, this pitiable event, now long past, should not prevent you from joining the ranks of citizens, right? He literally killed his son, and it's described as this pitiable event, right? So the court is doing exactly what I'm suggesting that immigration law these days ought to do, which is to look at people in their whole lives and not do what immigration law does right now, which is to tie migrants to their worst moments. And we've done that in the past, but when all we hear is the latest complaint about who's showing up at the border, it's almost impossible to have enough perspective to be able to say, well, in the past we've actually done things very differently, and those people managed to build their lives in the United States, and their children built their lives in the United States, and their children's children did, and now we're probably on, the children of the children of the children of Louis Loftus Rapoulier, all of whom have been U.S. citizens contributing to life in whatever community they call home.
Absolutely. And one feature of the book, and obviously I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but it is chock full of stories of just regular immigrants, regular people who one day decided to make this nation their home, and warts and all, just as they are, with their imperfections, they managed to make it. And their lives aren't perfect, just like Cesar's life isn't perfect, or mine, or any of our lives is perfect. And perhaps that's, at least on a personal level, that's one of the biggest contributions of your book, and that is that it debunks the myth of exceptionalism when it comes to who immigrants are. Immigrants are unexceptional in the same way that U.S.-born people are unexceptional. We're all kind of, and I wrote a review of Jose's book, Cesar's book. Jose is someone else that it's in the book that I'm thinking about. And one thing that I said in my review was, we're all kind of on the same boat. We're all splashing about trying to make it to the other side. And obviously, there's a subtext there that immigration law at one point called immigrants wetbacks, and it's and in a sense, immigration law has all these kind of really odious stereotypes built into it. And yet here we are, and I want to ask you about this exceptionalist frame. One, how do you arrive at it? How did you kind of get there? And also with that, well, I'll ask you the second question after you answer that one.
Yeah, every time I say, more or less what you did, right? That the way I think about migrants is the way I think of U.S. citizens, as we're just a bunch of ordinary, average people who mostly go about our days in an unremarkable fashion and pretty regularly don't even manage to meet that. Mm-hmm. And I feel like every time I say a version of that, like the air just gets sucked out of the room, right? We don't like to think of ourselves as unexceptional, except, that the word means something that requires that most of us not be exceptional. So I got to that because I come to immigration from a very personal lens. I was born and raised in South Texas and along the border in an immigrant community. And so for me, immigrants were just the people around me. Some of the most important people around me, from parents to aunts and uncles, to friends and neighbors, and in their lives, I could see like all of the sort of complications of just being an adult, and from the perspective of a young child, but among those complications were things that were obviously problematic that they were doing in some way or other, right? And so at times I knew that the adults in my life were doing stuff that they weren't supposed to do. And I knew that the way that any young child knows, because you hear it in a different tone, right? You hear it in whispers.
Hushed tones.
You hear it in hushed tones. Or your parents just tell you, don't talk about this outside the house, right? It's like, there's nothing implied about it. They're just quite clear. You were not supposed to have heard that, and you have, so we can't make you unhear it, but we can make it clear that there will be consequences if you decide to repeat that, right? And for me, it was, some of that stuff was like, one of my aunts who occasionally would help people cross the border, right? And sometimes they would use my birth certificate to do that, right? It was somebody who's more or less the same age, and there was no money in it for her. She was just doing it to be helpful, right? And I was too young to understand the nuances, certainly, but this was just part of who the people around me were. And so I could see that, yeah, they were, the people who cared about me, the people who loved me, the people who I cared about. But I also knew that they were doing something that apparently they weren't supposed to be doing. And I may not have understood why, but I understood that much. And so, why do I think of migrants as ordinary people, as not generally not exceptional? Well, it's because the people around me have always been that. And that doesn't mean they're not important to me. It just means I recognize that they are just they were important to me because of that particular relationship. But otherwise, I mean, we're just normal people, right, who do a little bit of everything.
So then at what point, and I hear you saying that we all have, so to speak, skeletons in our closet. I was actually thinking of, there's a Spanish saying, I don't know if you've heard it, los trapos sucios se lavan en casa, which means basically if you have kind of dirty rags in your home, you don't kind of air those out. You don't let people know that you have them, but we all do. Like we all have, dirty things that we don't want the rest of the world to know. And in that sense, we're all the same. We're all equal. And, immigrants and citizens alike are kind of in the same boat. But given the fact that we're all kind of in that we're all similarly situated like that, when this myth of exceptionalism begins to creep its way into the law, like why is it that one day we decided, all right, let's require and demand exceptionalism from our immigrants,
Yeah, I think that's been true for quite a long time, but the way that we have defined exceptionalism in immigration law has evolved, right? So for quite a long time, from the very beginning of federal immigration law in the late 19th century, we just decided Chinese were unfit because of their race, and then we expanded that to basically all Asians are just unfit for citizenship. And then fast forward to the end of the 20th century, the last few decades, and that's really when we start to land on crime as being the marker of undesirability, the stain that distinguishes one person from being ill-suited for full participation in our political community, and that leaves others perfectly well equipped. And I think for me, the fact that I've been on university campuses basically my entire adult life is a constant reminder that the outcome of a criminal legal process is at least as much a result of what people do as it is who they are and where they do it, right? Because any of the universities that I've spent any amount of time on anywhere in the United States, there is no shortage of crime happening in those places, right? And some of it is the kind of crime that it's sort of easy to dismiss. I live in Denver, so for the last 10 years, the crime in the form of low-level sale and distribution and possession of marijuana has been happening openly under neon signs, right? It's may not be criminal under state law, but it remains a crime under federal law, right? It remains a crime in many states around the United States. So there's that, right? That's easy to say, well, that's not real crime, right? But then there's the other stuff, right? The violent crime. Sadly, sexual assault is endemic on college campuses all over the United States, and yet no one stands on a college green and says, there goes a criminal undergraduate, right? And it's not because those people are any more morally upright. It's not because they are any more capable of controlling their worst tendencies. It's not because they have better judgment. It's simply because they have their worst moments in places where they are insulated from the power of the police, from prosecutors, and ultimately from the courts that might deem them guilty of a particular offense and others aren't. And as a result, they are able to move on. We are able to move on from our worst moments. And immigrants are so often just tied to that worst moment, and that becomes the entryway into the immigration prison and deportation pipeline.
Right, and there's a little kind of vignette in the book where you actually you write about how growing up in a border town, you were used to seeing Border Patrol, which is the federal agency that basically polices the border before they funnel them to ICE and other authorities, and you were used to seeing that kind of activity where you grew up, but you didn't see it as crime fighting necessarily. You just saw it as something that happened. You saw actual crime when you went to Brown as an undergrad, and I'm curious, as a young person seeing that for the first time and now looking back on that, because I mean, if it were me, and honestly, I was too much of a knucklehead in college to even think about doing anything bad. I was too focused on school. But someone who would see white kids not getting prosecuted because of who they are, but seeing other people who look like you getting prosecuted, that would totally shatter my idea of even a fair criminal legal system, period. Like why do we even have this? And I'm curious if you've ever, you kind of get close to this in the book, but you don't actually question necessarily, why even why do we have the criminal legal system that we have? And like, you do question how we do immigration enforcement, but I'm curious how you feel about our current system of mass incarceration, which is obviously, the biggest in the world, and immigration is a small slice of that.
Yeah, when I went to college, I it didn't take me very long, I mean, a matter of weeks before I had this realization that all of a sudden I was surrounded by a whole bunch of crime. I was like, what the hell is happening here? Like, I thought I was coming here to like learn something, and instead I'm just like watching all of these people do things that like are obviously illegal. Like, is this what college is supposed? Is this what college is supposed to be like?
And Brown has a nice campus too. I've been there once.
Yes, it's a lovely campus. So yes, it was crime happening under auspicious surroundings. But it was crime nonetheless, right? And I was just shocked because this is not what I expected. And so whenever I hear politicians these days talk about how the border in Texas is just it's overrun by criminals, and that discrepancy between the ordinariness of life, and the fact that crime happens all over the place and it only gets policed in some places, I can't put that out of my mind. And I think that's a big part of why it is that I am such a fierce critic of tacking on immigration consequences to the end of a criminal legal process, because the only way that we can justify doing that is if we decide either to bury our heads in sand and say, no, there are no biases in the criminal legal process, and therefore we can trust the outcomes and rely on the outcomes to decide who gets to live with their families or doesn't. Or it's because we say, well, that's a worthwhile cost, right? The reality is the criminal legal system, like every other legal process, it's just made up by people, right? And we are all fallible, and so there will be some imperfections, and at some point you have to decide, well, there have to be some acceptable trade-offs, and where that line is, that's not like a fixed objective determination that we can make, and so having that conversation is I think a worthwhile conversation about where it is to draw that line. I mean, I don't think the criminal legal system is anywhere near that in its current articulation. I find it hard to imagine that in the United States it would be possible to really fully, thoroughly remove racial bias and class bias from the criminal legal system, in part because We've never even tried to do that, right? That's never been a meaningful aspiration of the people who are intimately involved. We see, in fact, and I write about this a little bit, we see, in fact, instances in which judges have developed all kinds of legal doctrines that basically allow them to ignore the political climate that led to particular criminal laws being enacted, and specifically I'm talking about illegal entry and illegal re-entry, the two main federal immigration crimes. But now we have legal challenges to those laws that are being brought on constitutional bases, and federal judges these days saying, no, it doesn't matter that the legislators, the members of Congress, who voted for this bill, who wrote it, who promoted it, when it was making its way through Congress, were explicitly racist, right? What matters is that there have been basically a century's worth of members of Congress since then, and they never went back and said, oh yeah, we're going to keep this law because it unfairly discriminates based on race, and therefore we can just sort of pretend that it doesn't. And that, to me, is it is defensible as a matter of legal doctrine, but it is not defensible as a matter of the reality of how the law is experienced. And I think judges ought to care about how the law is experienced, because if people don't think and believe that the legal process is at least aspiring to fairness, then people stop believing in the legal process. And without that, the only way you can make people comply without them buying into the process is by hiring a whole hell of a lot more police than even what we currently have.
Yeah, there's a lot of, or not a lot, but there's a good chunk of the book that kind of hinges on this word that you use. It's legitimacy. The legitimacy. You talk about the legitimacy of the system, and I want to probe that a little bit. Why is it that this legitimacy matter from a normative kind of point of view? Because to the kid in the street, think of yourself when you were young, or here in New York, kids that see their classmates get stopped when they're walking into school because they look a certain way, or they get stopped and frisked, and who experience this discrimination in the flesh on a daily basis. To them, the system isn't legitimate at all. So I'm curious, why should we care about this legitimacy when in reality so many people don't see it as such?
Yeah, and I think actually we ought to care that the substantive law and the way that law is enforced conveys to people a sense of bias is so pervasive that they do not see it as legitimate, because it's not legitimate. That is a problem, right? Because at the point that people stop believing in the legal system's aspiration to fairness, right, and its ability to respond to the needs of the community, then there is no reason why people will attempt to comply with the law, right? And then at that point, we're just at a situation in which people do whatever they want,
right,
or the state essentially has to hire enough police to force everyone to do what they want. Neither of those are desirable outcomes. And so I think to the extent that the courts and the legislators are engaging in enacting laws or promoting laws that give a sense of fundamental unfairness to large numbers of our communities, it's incumbent upon those legislators and those judges to reevaluate the wisdom, because I think they are subverting the very institution that they have pledged their faith to, and doing us all a disservice, because I think if we don't have a functioning legal system, then we do get into a rather scary situation that I'd rather I'd rather not imagine all of the potential outcomes of that.
Sure. And I guess that's a good way to kind of segue, because one point that Cesar makes in the book is that talking about focusing squarely on immigration crimes, which is kind of a good chunk of the book, focuses on the fact that what we know as illegal border crossings is something that's kind of new. It's not a thing that we've always had. It's something that was kind of a creation of the early 1900s, and because it's kind of and mind you, once that crime was created, it wasn't really enforced for quite a while until almost a century later, maybe a little less, during the Bush presidency, and today these illegal border crossing crimes, I looked at the numbers. I cited to them in the review that I did of Cesar's book. It's about a third of federal prosecutors' caseloads in the country. Like, think if a prosecutor has 100 cases, 33% or something like that is border crossing crimes, and not just in border states, also in New York. I used to see these cases here in New York. Don't ask me how they would bring those cases here, but it's
that third actually represents like the largest category.
Yeah, it is the biggest, most enforced kind of statute in the federal code that prosecutors bring in terms of indictments, cases against people. And that goes to show that they're basically padding their numbers with these cases. If you took away all of these cases, you'd wonder what would these prosecutors be focused on, because they truly cut their teeth on a lot of these cases.
They would find something else.
They probably would.
Sure.
But again, it makes me think, because many of these migrants are unrepresented, they don't speak the language, they don't have a way to defend themselves, that it's almost like low-hanging fruit, for many of these prosecutors. Could you share with the audience what these hearings are like in at the border? How they're brought?
And I think this is one of those like features of the way that immigration law has bled into criminal law so much that it's cheapening the criminal legal process as well. And I find it astonishing that the prosecutors find this okay, because it's clear, and judges like that they go along with it, right? So what happens and this doesn't really happen outside of the southwest border, but it happens all over courthouses along the southwest. So typically when somebody is being prosecuted for a crime, there's a hearing in which the defendant is brought before a judge and a prosecutor accuses them of something, and have a lawyer, defense attorney next to them, and they have a hearing that's sort of focused on that person and that crime, and then the hearing ends, and then they move on to another defendant, right? And they focus on that person. Well, that's not the way that these
they give you a new court date sometimes,
you give a court date, and
they accept bail, or they let you go home.
Come back a few months later. You might be able to wait that time, in at home working with your family. You have time to talk to your lawyer. What happens though with these illegal entry and legal reentries, immigration crime prosecutions along the Southwest, is that the people who get picked up by Border Patrol get prosecuted so quickly that sometimes they don't even have an opportunity to change their clothes, and so they're getting prosecuted. They're getting brought into a hearing in a federal courthouse, but they're huge numbers of people. But the thing is, there's still only 24 hours in the day in Tucson, just like is true in New York City or Minneapolis, and so in order to go through 100 or 150 people in a criminal defendants in a day, they just bring them all in at once. And they sit them down in the benches in the courthouse. And the judge will address all of them at once and goes through and asks them sort of a series of questions about, did you enter the United States without the government's permission? Did you get apprehended and around such and such place? And the judge asks a question and then waits to hear a response from the group. But anyone who's ever spoken to a group of 15 or 50 or 85 people knows that if you ask a question, you wait for a response, you'll probably get something back, right? You'll hear something in response. I'm a teacher, so I'm like perfectly capable and comfortable waiting until I hear something, right? And so you get something back, but you don't know if the kid who's sitting in the back row opened his mouth, right? You have no idea whether they heard the question, and that's a problem when you're like at the front of a lecture hall. But it's truly troubling when the series of questions that you're asking ultimately lead to somebody getting convicted of a federal crime, which then comes with jail time, with prison time, and then obviously after that, deportation. And so we see this happening all the time, and as a result, it's such an enormous deviation from the way that most criminal proceedings operate that I think it makes a mockery of the outcome of that process, because those people don't have enough time to talk to their lawyers, because the lawyers get assigned 10, 15 defendants in the morning, and then that same morning they're in this hearing, right? There's no chance to talk to people about whether they have a defense. There's no chance to talk to people about whether what they're being accused of is true. There's no chance to figure out, are you actually like a U.S. citizen? And people think that it's obvious who is a U.S. citizen and who's not, but citizenship is just fundamentally, it's just a legal status. It's a legal relationship between the individual and the country, and as a result, it can be complicated sometimes, and there's just no opportunity to explore that. And yet, at the end of the process, that person is found guilty, because they're always found guilty, like 98% of the time they're found guilty, and then they're sentenced, right? And we can know for sure that person was convicted, but we cannot know for sure whether that person actually engaged in the crime that they were accused of, or whether or not there was some defense that maybe would have avoided a conviction. And to the extent that we care about the legal process, I think we should care about whether or not people are getting convicted just for the sake of convictions, or whether they're getting convicted because that's what the law required.
And lest we forget, the two statutes that keep calling Jose. Jose is a person in his book.
He's
That's
the
why
person with whom I start the book.
Yeah, he starts the book with a person named Jose, who is also a character that I've been researching for a while. But anyway, the two statutes, 8 U.S.C. 1325 and 8 U.S.C. 1326. Don't ask me why I know that, but these two laws, it's. Again, lest we forget, they're the laws that the Trump administration used to justify family separation. A lot of people don't know that, but that was kind of the criminal hook to say, okay, this person who crossed the border was found to have committed a crime, and crime is a justification for this person cannot be with children. That gives us the legal reason to be able to separate them. Anyway, it was awful. But you call for the abolition of these laws, and the reality, and I want you to address this to the extent you can, is that criminalizing folks who cross the border doesn't stop them from coming.
Well, I think Jose is a great example of this.
Yes.
So somebody who came when he was to the United States for the first time when he was fairly young. He's got some mental health, schizophrenia, right? And drug abuse as well. And he has been convicted a host of times, almost all because of entering the United States without the federal government's permission. And every single time, he just comes right back. Right? And the reality is that for most people, for people who have strong ties to the United States, the legal status is secondary, right? If they have family here, if they have children here, if they have spouses here, if they have a job here, a house here, a community here, at some point that community becomes more important than whatever you may have had in the place that you once called home, right? And so it should never surprise anyone that a person is going to go to whatever length necessary to reunite with the people who are most meaningful to them. What one Supreme Court justice once described as all that makes life worth living. And immigration law takes a super myopic view that moving people, deporting people, is just moving them around the face of the earth without any punitive consequence attached to it. But when you move people across the face of the earth in such a way that makes it impossible or extremely difficult to see and spend time with the people who are most important to them, then the reality is it's experienced as punitive, and the law can say whatever the law wants to say, but as long as judges are repeat the claim that deporting people is not punitive, and it's just showing them to be sort of buying into this false myth about how the law actually is felt and how it actually operates in the real world. And it's also just ignoring the reality that lots of those people, they're just going to come back. And if you make it harder, then it's going to be more expensive and they might die in the process. But just because it's more expensive and they might die, it doesn't mean a lot of them aren't going to try if everything that matters to them is here.
Exactly. And speaking of realities, it's also kind of connected to the reality that, at least in this country, and obviously our influence is felt elsewhere, we tend to throw prison and policing and punishment at social problems that we think by throwing people in prison, we're somehow making the problem go away or tackling it in a meaningful way. But the reality is that, as you just said, people keep coming. And in the same way that we criminalize certain acts, I don't know, think of turnstile jumping, and I'm thinking of all the money that New York City spends on
jumping, an aggravated felony as far as immigration law is concerned.
There you go. And again, that kind of, I was kind of thinking of that because at least here we spent so much policing that particular kind of quote unquote crime. Crime is kind of in the eye of the beholder there, because you don't know when someone truly needs to get somewhere for truly out of need. They need to be somewhere at a certain time, go to school, go to work, and they don't have a way to pay for it. You know what I mean? But instead of tackling that, the fact that someone needs to get somewhere, we decide to throw, enforcement at it. And we think that by doing that, we are actually, doing something meaningful for society, but we're not. And I'm curious, obviously, you don't I don't think you are an abolitionist, but this book sounds an abolition in terms of, not just in terms of getting rid of certain offenses and certain statutes that are not helping anyone, but also in the sense that you would like to see an immigration system that kind of looks forward and looks at people as a whole, and that builds up rather than tears down. And an abolition, for people who study it and who know it, is not just about tearing old systems down, but it's also about building up new structures and new forms of building our society in a way that kind of envisions a way we support people's true material needs. We don't just, punish them when they're trying to survive. So let us move to that part of your book, which is, how you reimagine the immigration system, and how do you get to that point? Because when I was reading it, it looks like you're truly trying to get at something that doesn't quite exist just yet. And I'm curious if that's still a thought process that you're kind of working in your head and still belaboring.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. So first off, I do think that I bring an abolitionist perspective, right, to the book, and a key component of that is not just sort of critiquing what exists, but also trying to imagine the productive response, not just the destructive response, right? And so that's why I end the book with a couple of chapters on citizenship and how it is that I think we can reimagine and reinvigorate citizenship, because citizenship is a constantly evolving phenomenon. It begins in the United States with 2 centuries worth of racial restrictions. It's not until the middle of the 20th century that we finally eliminate the last of the racial restrictions on citizenship. It's not until the early part of the 20th century that women can fully possess their own citizenship independently of their fathers and their husbands, right? And it's that constant evolution that brings me a sense of hope that citizenship can continue to evolve, and it can continue to evolve in a direction that accepts whole people, blemishes and all. In part because the citizenry already includes people who are full of blemishes. Right, we were talking earlier about Donald Trump, and that's obviously the most prominent example, and however many dozen indictments or charges he's currently facing. Right, but like aside from sort of those prominent examples, we see this in the much more ordinary people, and that's not to say that there are not enormous biases in the criminal legal system. I've already said that I acknowledge that there are. I mean, I don't mean to paper over those at all. But what I want to focus on is the fact that like given that the citizenry is regularly willing to welcome the more privileged among us who fail in a way that is criminal, then I think we ought to be willing to do that with people who were not born in the United States, so that we can ask instead of what we do now, which is do you have any criminal history? And that's generally enough to bar people from citizenship. I'd instead want our citizenship law moving forward to focus on people's commitment to this experiment in democracy, right? And so that I think of it as having 2 components. One is sort of believing in valuing core components of the democratic process. Another is actually participating in small d democracy, and that can include things like being involved in electoral campaigns, but democracy happens in ways that are way more diverse, and to a large extent way more meaningful than electoral politics, right? And it's that kind of sort of commitment to the collective social enterprise that I think is the true source of the vitality of the United States, that I think citizenship law ought to be focused on and ought to be using as the measure of full participation in the political community, and not did you happen to get prosecuted and convicted for a crime.
It's not even that. I mean, I'll tell you, I don't know how many of you have gone through the naturalization process. I did a long time ago. But there's a question there. I remember it because it's almost unanswerable. And the question is, have you ever committed a crime, even one for which you haven't been prosecuted?
Right. So have to lie.
I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Everyone
has to say yes.
Right?
Right?
So, all of us have, in theory, all of us have that answer. We have to answer yes to that.
Except those of us who are lying to ourselves.
Right. Exactly. Right. or even arrested or prosecuted. It's almost like even if you've kind of thought about doing it. I don't know. It sounded almost as if a crime that happened, but you never got caught
Yeah.
almost like that. But
It's heavy.
we've all done something like that in our lives.
Yeah.
So it's almost like this country demands, going back to the exceptionalism point, almost an insurmountable ideal.
Yeah, but you should say no to that question. Like, just to be clear, the answer should be yes, but actually the answer has to be no.
It has to be
because
no.
otherwise, then the answer to your
I don't
request
even
for
want to know.
naturalization is no.
Yeah, I don't even want to know what happens.
So we begin the citizenship process for people on a lie, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just saying, look, just don't do that, because we all, if the answer for all of us is the same, what good is this question?
Yeah, it's almost like they're asking you to perjure yourself in your own citizenship application, and it's interesting because in that part of the book where you're trying to reimagine citizenship, or at least get at a new conception of citizenship, you give an example of Ravi Ragbir, who is here in New York City. He is the head of the New Sanctuary Coalition, I believe the name of his organization. I actually interviewed Ravi too as part of my project at the Knight Institute a few years ago. He's an amazing character. And one thing that Ravi's case kind of exemplifies for me, and I'll give you a quick rundown of his case. Basically, he is a very vocal immigrant rights activist here in the city, and during the Trump administration, he went for his immigration check-in, something that ICE makes you do every so often when you are basically removable. And he went for his check-in, and they basically told him, we're going to deport you, after going for many such check-ins without ever being threatened with deportation. And he fought his deportation. He had a huge team around him, people, clergy, city council members who supported his case. He actually sued the feds under the First Amendment for retaliating against his advocacy, because he is a vocal critic of harsh immigration policies. And basically, he was able to win his case because the court found that, in fact, the government did retaliate against him based on his views of the immigration of the administration at the time. Yet, even though Ravi is an amazing case, there are many people who don't have the kind of support structure that Ravi does, or are not vocal immigrant rights activists or leaders in their communities. And yet, there are many that do in fact are working towards this future, towards this new conception of citizenship. They're not waiting necessarily for Congress to abolish immigration crimes. And I'm curious if you could just quickly, as we close, and I'm going to open it up for questions after this question. So if you have one or two questions for César, please let me know. What are some ways that immigrants today are already reconceptualizing citizenship? Because they are doing things, and because many of them know that Congress is not going to budge given the current situation, they have to make do with what they have, and they're doing things right now today.
Yeah, so I think the most important way is by really pushing back against this narrative of exceptionalism. Or back around 2010, when the last time that the DREAM Act really had a lot of support in Congress and looked like it could potentially get enacted, there was an enormous a push from what I think of as sort of the big, well-resourced, DC-centered advocacy groups to frame the dreamers, as they were called, as being these extraordinary kids, these extraordinary young people. And to a certain extent, the law that the DREAM Act would have created would have required that of them, right? College education or military service, having avoided criminal convictions, etc.
Then you have Obama saying families, not felons.
Families, not felons, right? Because apparently families don't have felons, and felons don't have families. And to the credit of a lot of the young people who would have benefited from the DREAM Act that ultimately failed, they said no. We're not willing to derive a benefit if the cost is to demonize and to penalize the people who brought us here, because they don't view those people as, the way that we so often hear about them talked about now as smugglers. They view them as their parents, right? And all of their complexity of parenting. And they were unwilling to sell their parents and other relatives off as bargaining chips in this political negotiation. And so I think that has been an enormous source of inspiration for me, right? To think of trying of taking a critical approach toward the law that currently exists and trying to imagine what would come next, because if they're willing to push back, these are people who are far more concretely affected than I am, because I was born in the United States, then I think it's incumbent on the rest of us to follow their lead.
Yep, and the reality too is that they're like those young people who are not willing to compromise. There's communities today that are doing things locally, whether it is to decouple their own communities, their own sheriff's departments from working with ICE, getting their city councils to just look at their local jail budgets because their local jails are dependent on ICE money. There are ways that they're doing this work.
Yeah, but then ICE is also contracting around those options, because as long as they can buy access to that same information from third-party private companies, they can get everything they want.
They're finding workarounds.
City council or state legislature in some Democratic-controlled place, be damned. We'll just go around you, and I write about that in the book. But that's what we're seeing happening in the last few years.
They're finding workarounds, but immigrants and immigrant rights activists are also a huge inspiration to me as I read about them in Cesar's book, but also in my own work. And we should all look to them, because they're the ones who are already reimagining citizenship in ways that isn't waiting for Congress to do something. I was curious if anyone has a question that for Cesar here about anything, or the book, or
about anything,
or even
I can answer all of the
even
questions.
Current immigration news that you've seen, because it's an interesting time to talk immigration. And if you have one, go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize that I got excited during the informal.
No, totally.
It is kind of like with there's this idea of the law that you're innocent until proven guilty. That's when the crime is official, but that's really not the case in a lot of the way immigration law operates. It's really the opposite in some ways, but I digress. So with the news of what's going on in the Senate and the bill right now, my understanding, I heard something about expedited, maybe even border crossing agents making a determination on asylum.
Yeah. And
thoughts about that, and how that, if that, how different that would be from what's already going on, and legally speaking, and the sort of definitions of crime, right? What any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so during the early parts of the pandemic, the Trump administration dusted off that decades-old public health law called Title 42, and used it to accomplish what the administration had been hoping to do for years up until that point, which is to basically stop people from applying for asylum. And you were able to use the justification of the pandemic to do that. And then eventually the Biden administration finally got rid of that last May. So it took them a long time, but they did eventually get rid of that. Well, the bill that just got unveiled 48 hours ago or whatever it was, would essentially make a permanent, well, not permanent, but would codify the power to do exactly that. It uses as a trigger the number of people who Border Patrol apprehends in a given day. So if the Border Patrol were to apprehend 5,000 people a day over a 7-day period, then then immigration officials would be required to essentially seal off the border to anyone requesting asylum. It has exemptions for U.S. citizens, permanent residents, etc. But for folks who want to come here to request asylum, it would just say, we're not doing that right now. And the reality is, in December of last year, Border Patrol was apprehending almost 10,000 people, right? So if that had been the law already, then this would already be what we would be seeing. And so in a way, the bill is just sort of prolonging the Title 42 policy that the Trump administration inaugurated. And then even when that provision is not in effect, it would allow asylum officers at the border to really quickly make determinations about who merits moving on to the next step of the asylum process. But it would require them to do it in as quickly as 72 hours. And then if it gets denied and the migrant wants to request review of that, the only review is of the record that was produced in that initial hearing. But of course, like, most people don't carry around documentation showing what happened to them if they are fleeing for their lives, right? This is what one of the things that immigration lawyers do in an asylum case, is spend a whole lot of time producing evidence. I mean, this is what lawyers generally do, is you produce evidence to support your client's interests. And that would essentially eliminate that option. And I think the goal is to just reach decisions on asylum applications faster. And sure, can we do that? Yes. But making a decision isn't a good in and of itself, right? If you do it in such a way that it subverts the legitimacy of the process by not giving the people whose lives are at stake enough time to really make out whatever claim might be available to them under the law that exists. Yeah.
And it gives tons of money to Border Patrol and ICE, and more than any other time in history, I think, right? Yeah. So the amount of money that ICE would get for additional amount of money that ICE would get under this bill, just to expand the number of detention beds that it has available right now, is almost equivalent to ICE's total budget in 2005. Right? 3.2 billion. Extra money for detention beds, and I think ICE's detention bed budget is something like $3 billion right now. So we're talking about 6, more or less.
You just came back around to the legitimacy of the policy. I've been thinking, and then you mentioned the cost and the amount of resources people throw at for-profit detention centers, ICE. Those resources could be need to be allocated. I mean, it's a racket.
Yeah, for sure. There's a ton of money to be made off of this. Yeah.
There's a film project called The Welcome Table.
Mm-hmm.
A Brooklyn filmmaker named Josh Fox is putting displaced. It's focused. Climate change is the envelope, but he's putting displaced people within the United States next to displaced people from Guatemala, the people, farmers who can't farm anymore, saying, you have a common, right? But it's a conversation that's now going to happen in March 2024.
Yeah. Yeah.
The resources is kind of the driving power of the conversation.
Yeah. I think these are two really important points, and I raise in particular the financial component of this, right? Because there is an immense amount of money to be made, and private companies. My last book was about prison system, so I talked very squarely about the private prison industry. Here in this book, I write about companies like LexisNexis and Palantir that are very much dependent on their contracts with government agencies. And these government agencies, ICE and Border Patrol in particular, are relying on enormous quantities of data that these companies access and pour into their databases. And some of that data it's very, very benign stuff, like usernames for social media, right? And other information is stuff. Yeah, it's ways that they piece together bits of information from stuff like social media, utilities, driver's license applications and files, and their goal is to try to put together a composite picture of a particular individual, so that when ICE or Border Patrol runs across a particular person, they can quickly find out about this person's background. Or if they are looking for a particular person, they can figure out how to find that person, right? And this is exactly the kind of information that states like California, Oregon, cities from Denver to Seattle really have tried to bar ICE and Border Patrol from accessing. And so as they've enacted laws saying, no, our government agencies can't share this information with you, the federal government agencies have said, well, that's fine. Congress gives us all kinds of money. We'll just go buy this information if we can't get it from you for free. And essentially, I think what they're doing is they're buying their way around the messiness of democracy. Yes. Good.
This isn't a legal question so much, but I had a really scary incident a few weeks ago. I work for the New York City Housing Authority, and I was working with a residents group that's trying to preserve public housing, which is now literally on the auction block right now. And this was when the quote immigrant crisis was hitting. Adams was really playing up, the strain it's putting on the city, and there was a proposal to move them, out of the shelters into public housing. And it was interesting to be at a meeting of a very disenfranchised group of people who average $18,000 a year, all people of color. And several people, it wasn't the majority opinion, but several people said they're giving our housing to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, I expect that shit from Trump.
Mm-hmm.
But this was people, they're getting, all these laws really seem to be based on building popular support for this as well. The whole propaganda machine, and you do see a lot of Democrats saying, take it as a given that Biden needs to that there is a problem. Biden needs to get tough on this, and so I don't really have a question. It's just when you see people, especially at the bottom of the pyramid, fighting with each other with this kind of thing, and buying into the narrative that they are hitting us. As someone who's not going to be a victim of these laws, so I find that very frightening. It's a tough narrative to combat. I want to get ideas about how to push back against that.
Right. Well, the people who are least benefited by migrants are the people who are most tenuously attached to survival, right? So the people who are barely able to sustain a roof over their heads, right? The people who are barely able to feed themselves and clothe their children, right? So those are the people who are least benefited, but the source of the tension and the source of the problem, the reason why they're struggling to stay in housing of whatever kind or meet their other basic needs, isn't because you have some people showing up here from Venezuela, right? It's because there's no social safety net, right? It's because we've had decades of public policy failures that have made it so difficult to afford housing, not just in this city, but in cities throughout the United States, right? And it's the only relationship that immigrants have to the housing shortage is that they're the ones who build the housing, right? And so I think it's not that they shouldn't. It's not that those people are wrong to be upset or scared. It's that their target and the actual source of their situation, not the folks who have been here for a few weeks, but the folks who have been in political power and making these decisions for the last several decades, right? And those are exactly the people who are saying, no, you should be pointing at the people who just showed up, right? And it makes sense that they're doing that, because the last thing they want is for anyone to point the finger at them. And it doesn't matter if they're Republicans or Democrats, right?
Which is exactly my response when we had this
Yeah.
discussion, but still, the acceptance of the scapegoating is still, something that
It's powerful.
actively pushing to get support.
Right.
Kind of calling it.
Yeah, because if you're a regular person, who's barely holding on to your public housing, what the hell are you gonna do against the mayor of New York or the president of the United States, right? You have no power in that relationship.
And the reality too is that those newly arrived migrants, their sustenance, their freedom, it's in a way it's kind of deeply tied up to theirs as well, because they're both in the same boat. They should be allies in a sense, because they're both disempowered in different ways, and if anything, to the extent that we find that those points of solidarity between these communities is how you're able to show them that there's power in the numbers to contest the status quo. And I don't want to extend it anymore because we've gone for a while, but I want us to give a hand to Cesar and thank him for his book. Thank you for this book, and I appreciate you all. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming. Thank you, Christian.